How long can a person run before the road itself begins to judge her? The question clung to Lauren Hayes as the sun beat down on the worn boards of Red Hollow's Main Street, the heat shimmering like a veil between her and the rest of the world. For 3 long years she had lived beneath the shadow of a crime she did not commit, carrying the weight of a wrongful conviction like a brand burned into her skin. Everywhere she went, whispers followed. Eyes narrowed, doors closed, and now, with dust in her throat and hunger twisting through her stomach, she stepped into Maggie's place, the only diner in a small western town that looked tired just from existing, hoping for nothing more than a glass of water, a meal she could work to repay, and a little mercy. Mercy did not live here. The moment her name surfaced, spoken with a curl of contempt, the room turned on her. Conversations froze. Faces hardened. The owner's voice rose sharp and public, stripping away the last scraps of Lauren's dignity. She tried to explain, tried to cling to the truth the court had refused to hear, but the verdict had already been cast in the eyes of Red Hollow. Criminal, thief, not welcome. She was ordered out before the water ever reached her lips. She left with humiliation ringing louder than her footsteps, the desert light swallowing her as though the world itself was done with her. Exhaustion dragged at every bone. The years of running, of sleeping in borrowed corners and walking until night blurred with dawn, had hollowed her out. She barely noticed when the bundle she carried slipped from her grasp. What she did notice was a small, bare foot plant itself in front of her in the dirt. Then another, and then a child's voice, clear, honest, not yet trained in cruelty, saying, "Ma'am, you dropped this." Lauren lifted her gaze and found a girl no older than 8 or 9, with wind-tangled hair and eyes too sincere for a land so full of secrets. Ellie Carter. She didn't flinch from Lauren, didn't judge. She simply held out the little bundle as if returning it might somehow repair the woman's faith in the world. Ellie studied her, brow furrowing with concern far too deep for a child. "You're hungry," she said quietly, as if hunger was not a shameful accusation but an observable truth, like the color of the sky or the direction of the wind. Then came the invitation, simple, impossibly generous. Her home was nearby. Her father would let Lauren rest. There was water. There was food. And for a moment, Lauren felt the fragile part of herself that still wanted to believe in people ache toward the promise. She hesitated. Strangers were dangerous. Kindness, she had learned, sometimes came with a price she couldn't afford, but Ellie's trust felt real, and the weariness pressing down on Lauren's shoulders left little room for pride. So they walked together across the brittle land toward the Carter Ranch, a modest stretch of earth carved out of hardship and hope. The house was plain, the fences mended more with patience than money, and yet the place breathed of care. Chickens scattered at their approach. A horse lifted its head with slow curiosity. And then Daniel Carter stepped out from the shadow of the porch. He was a man shaped by grief, the kind that doesn't shout but settles quiet and permanent in a person's bones. There was caution in his eyes when he saw Lauren, a reflex of survival in a land where trust could get you killed. A widower, a father. A man who had learned the hard way that the world did not always play fair. But Ellie moved to his side and took his hand as if to anchor the truth of her words. She told him who Lauren was, not the whispered slurs, but a woman alone and tired who needed rest. And Daniel listened. Not like the diner crowd, not with judgment preloaded. He looked at Lauren as if he were measuring not her past, but the way she stood in the present, the way she carried her pain. After a moment that felt like it might decide the rest of her life. He nodded once and opened his home. Inside, the Carter house felt like memory and absence woven together. Every corner carried the echo of Grace Carter, the wife Daniel had lost. Yet the place was kept with care, not frozen in grief. That night, they ate stew at a plain wooden table. Ellie bowed her head and said grace the way her mother had taught her, and Lauren, who had long ago stopped expecting God to intervene, still felt the words settle softly across the room. For the first time in years, no one spoke to her like a criminal, No one asked her to leave. No one looked at her like a contagion. Daniel, careful and honest, asked about her past only after the dishes were cleared and Ellie had slept. He didn't interrogate. He didn't accuse. He simply asked for the truth, and Lauren gave it. She told him how she had once worked as a governess for a wealthy family, and how Victor Mallory and his associates had fabricated a theft to shield their darker scheme. How the system had chosen convenience over justice, and how her life had burned down around her. Daniel listened, really listened, and when she finished, he didn't rush to judgment. He believed her, not blindly, but with the quiet conviction of a man who knew how easily truth could be buried when money and power decided to dig. He offered her a place at the ranch, temporary at first, fair wages, clear boundaries. A chance, not forgiveness, not salvation, just the simple right to be treated like a human being again. In the days that followed, Lauren worked hard. She cooked, cleaned, mended fences, tended chickens, and slowly stitched herself into the rhythm of ranch life. Ellie adored her. Daniel respected her. And though the world outside those fence lines still called her guilty, inside the Carter home, for the first fragile time, Lauren felt something she had almost forgotten how to recognize. The beginning of belonging. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm that felt almost like safety, though Lauren never quite trusted it enough to breathe fully. Dawn rose over the Carter ranch with the slow bloom of pale gold, and she was always up before the rooster, moving through the kitchen with quiet hands, heating water, kneading dough, listening to the soft creak of the old house as if it were a living thing learning to accept her presence. Daniel said little most mornings, but what he said mattered. His trust did not come wrapped in warm words. It arrived instead as small permissions. The first day he left Ellie in her care for an afternoon. Another day he trusted her to balance the accounts at the kitchen table. Then he handed her the keys to the tack room without a word. Each gesture landed carefully, like boards laid across a chasm, and Lauren stepped onto each one with equal parts gratitude and fear. She worked hard, harder than she had ever worked, because effort was something she could control, and she had lost control of everything else. Ellie bloomed beside her, laughing louder, asking more questions, tugging Lauren by the hand toward the chicken coop or the creek as if joy were a simple thing that could be fetched and carried. And though Daniel still kept long silences, the edges of them softened. Sometimes, at the end of the day, he would sit on the porch while she mended or shelled peas, and they would talk about weather, livestock, or the way the valley changed color at sunset. Nothing sentimental, nothing reckless. Yet beneath each ordinary word ran an unspoken thread. Two lives damaged differently, slowly rediscovering the idea of trust. But the land itself carried secrets, and secrets in the West do not sleep forever. It was in the barn loft that the truth first reached out to Lauren. She had climbed up there to straighten old saddles and sweep out mouse nests, the dust rising like ghosts around her, when one loose board on the far wall caught her attention. It shifted under her hand with a hollow sound. Behind it, tucked into darkness, she found a leather-bound journal wrapped in a faded shawl that still smelled faintly of lavender and something older, like grief. The name on the first page was written in a firm, graceful hand. Grace Carter. Lauren hesitated. This was the private heart of a woman who no longer lived. The wife Daniel still carried like a quiet wound. But something in the weight of that journal, something in the way the shawl had been folded, like someone meant it to be found one day, urged her on. She read slowly at first, then with increasing dread. Grace had not been just a ranch wife. She had been observant, thoughtful, meticulous. She had seen things, men meeting in shadows, papers that changed hands, families who somehow lost their land overnight after legal adjustments, names that kept repeating: Victor Mallory, Charles Whitman, Robert Langford, and threaded through the entries was a corporation that sounded respectable on paper but moved like a predator beneath the valley's surface. Western Frontier Holdings. Grace had traced patterns Lauren had never been allowed to see during her trial. forged signatures, intimidation masked as debt collection, land deeds corrected by the county under Sheriff Randall Pierce's watch. And then there was Lauren's name, woven into the conspiracy like barbed wire. Grace believed the theft accusation had been manufactured not because of money, but because Lauren had become inconvenient, a piece that had to be removed before larger plans could move forward unchecked. The final pages shifted in tone. Words broke. Letters shook. Grace described being followed. She believed her questions had been noticed. And only days before her death in the creek, she wrote one final chilling line. "If anything happens to me, it will not be an accident." Lauren closed the journal and felt the world tilt. The room around her, the dust, the ropes, the swallows nesting in the rafters, remained stubbornly ordinary. And yet nothing was ordinary any longer. Someone had killed Grace, and the same hands responsible had torn Lauren's life apart. Rage crept up, quiet and controlled, the way it does when sorrow finally gets tired of being polite. That night, she told Daniel, she did not dramatize it. She laid the journal on the table between them like a confession neither of them had spoken aloud. He read in silence, the only sound the brittle turning of pages and the ticking of the old mantel clock. She saw his jaw tighten, the muscles jumping once in a way that said more than anger ever could. When he finally looked up, it was with a clarity that cut straight through fear. He had suspected. He had never had proof. Now he did. They did not shout. They did not make wild plans. They spoke like people who understood that truth can be as dangerous as any weapon. They would gather more evidence, quietly. They would speak to those they trusted, which was a very short list. They would protect Ellie above all else, and they would not run. Not anymore. Lauren had run enough for one lifetime. The following weeks were a careful dance along the edge of a blade. Lauren continued her chores, laughing with Ellie, riding into town for supplies with Daniel, nodding politely to the very men whose signatures had almost destroyed her. Victor Mallory's handshake was smooth. Charles Whitman's smile practiced. Sheriff Randall Pierce's gaze lingered a fraction too long, and under every civil word passed the silent knowledge that if any of them sensed what Lauren and Daniel now knew, the cost would be immediate and absolute. At night, after Ellie slept, they sorted through ledgers and deeds by lamplight, comparing Grace's notes with public records. What emerged was a map of corruption wide enough to swallow the valley whole. Lauren felt fear. Yes, but something else too. Something like the return of her own spine. For the first time since the accusation, she was no longer merely surviving the story. She was inside it with purpose. The fragile refuge they had built could no longer be just a refuge. It had become a front line, and somewhere in the distance, the storm that had started years before with a false charge and a slammed courtroom door was circling back toward Red Hollow, gathering force. Danger has a way of announcing itself before it ever knocks on the door. On the Carter Ranch, it began as a shift in the air, a tension running beneath the steady rhythm of daily work. Lauren and Daniel kept moving, feeding livestock, fixing fences, tending to chores. But now every task carried a second layer of purpose. At night, once Ellie had been kissed goodnight and her lamp blown out, the kitchen table turned into a war room of quiet investigation. Ledgers, deeds, notes from Grace's journal. All of it was spread out in careful order. Every page a small rebellion against the powerful men who had assumed no one would dare to connect the dots. Daniel rode out discreetly to speak with a few old friends, people who had lost land under mysterious circumstances. Lauren wrote lists, cross-referencing dates and transfers. Together they built a picture of Western frontier holdings that no court could ignore, provided it ever reached one. There were days when hope ran high, when the truth seemed close enough to grasp. And there were nights when Lauren lay awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering courtrooms, iron bars, and how quickly truth could vanish when money spoke louder. Through it all, Ellie remained the bright core of the house, laughing, chattering, drifting through the rooms like sunlight. She knew something weighed on the adults she loved, but neither Lauren nor Daniel allowed the shadow to touch her directly. They guarded her with every breath. That guard would soon be tested. The first sign came from town. Samuel Brooks, the store owner who had always treated Lauren with a level gaze and steady courtesy, pulled Daniel aside one afternoon. Word was traveling. Sheriff Randall Pierce had been asking questions about the Carter Ranch, about Lauren, about late-night visitors and unusual accounting records being sent east by post. The sheriff's tone hadn't sounded curious. It had sounded prepared. Daniel returned home that evening with his jaw locked tight. Lauren saw it from the porch and knew before he spoke that the circle had begun to close. They debated leaving just for a moment, the idea passing between them like a flicker of wind. But running would confirm guilt that wasn't there. And more than that, it would abandon the truth they had come so painfully close to holding up to the light. They stayed. They prepared. They trusted that the federal marshal, whose name Grace had once mentioned in her notes, Ethan Caldwell, was still watching the valley from somewhere beyond the horizon. Days later, the trouble arrived, carried in with a plume of dust and the harsh gleam of iron badges. Sheriff Randall Pierce rode up with 2 deputies, each of them heavy with the self-assurance of men who believed themselves untouchable. The moment Daniel stepped from the porch, Lauren pulled Ellie behind her, heart hammering so hard she could feel each beat in her throat. Pierce dismounted slowly, like a man savoring victory. He announced his purpose with exaggerated calm. A fire in town, property damage, witnesses, statements. Lauren Hayes was accused of arson. He had a warrant in his hand and a smirk in his eyes, as though the ink itself would wipe away the fragile life she had built here. Lauren felt the world shrink around her. It was happening again, fabricated charges, a story written without her voice. Only this time, she was not alone. Ellie stepped forward before anyone could stop her voice clear, trembling not with fear, but fury. She called the sheriff a liar, said that Lauren had been with them, said she knew what he and those men had done. For a heartbeat, everything stilled. Pierce's gaze slid from Ellie to Lauren to Daniel, and something darkened there. The mask slipped, just a fraction. He ordered the deputies to take Lauren. Daniel moved faster than thought, placing himself between them. His voice never rose, but it carried the weight of a threat older than law itself. This would not happen again. One deputy went for his weapon. Lauren grabbed Ellie and pulled her close, bracing for the chaos she could feel gathering like thunder. And then, like a gunshot through glass, a new voice cut across the yard. "Stand down." The man who rode in from the road wore the star of the United States Marshals with a gravity that needed no explanation. Ethan Caldwell was not loud. He did not posture. He carried authority the way some men carry scars, earned and undeniable. Behind him, more riders appeared, not deputies of Pierce, but federal men, faces set, mission clear. Caldwell dismounted and approached with the unhurried certainty of someone who had been waiting for this moment far longer than any of them realized. He took the warrant from Pierce's hand, read it, and then calmly tore it in two. The sheriff sputtered, outrage bubbling over into protest, but Caldwell silenced him with a single glance. He announced federal warrants, real ones, naming Victor Mallory, Charles Whitman, Robert Langford, and yes, Sheriff Randall Pierce himself. Charges: fraud, conspiracy, land theft, coercion, and suspicion of murder in connection with the death of Grace Carter. The ranch seemed to exhale. Deputies loyal to Pierce hesitated, then lowered their weapons as federal officers stepped forward. Pierce fought it, of course. Bluster, denial, threats. But his voice sounded smaller now, like a man realizing the walls he had built were suddenly closing in on him instead. He was placed in irons on the very land he had once believed was under his control. Caldwell turned to Lauren. He spoke her name as if it still belonged to her, not as a label stamped by a crooked court. He told her that her case had been reopened, that evidence had been gathered, that lies had finally begun to unravel. He didn't offer apologies on behalf of the system. Instead, he gave her something far rarer in the West, the promise of a fair hearing. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wind moved across the field. Ellie slipped her hand into Lauren's, and Daniel stood close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. It wasn't victory yet. The road ahead would still twist, still ask more of them than seemed fair. But the direction had finally changed. The conspiracy had tried to tighten its grip, to drag them back into the shadows. Instead, under a broad western sky, truth had stepped forward with a badge on its chest and a file thick with names that could no longer hide. And for the first time since her world had burned down around her, Lauren Hayes felt the ground steady beneath her feet. The road to justice rarely arrives with fanfare. It comes in letters stamped with official seals, in testimonies carefully spoken, in the slow and painful sorting of truth from the lies people told themselves to sleep at night. For Lauren Hayes, the weeks that followed the arrests were a blur of interviews, affidavits, and courtrooms where the truth was finally allowed to breathe. Ethan Caldwell worked with a quiet steadiness, never promising more than the law could honestly give, but refusing to let the case disappear into paperwork the way it once had. Grace Carter's journal became a cornerstone, her last gift to a world that had tried to silence her. The ledgers, the forged deeds, the frightened witnesses who now stepped forward with trembling voices. All of it formed a net that closed around Victor Mallory, Charles Whitman, Robert Langford, and the disgraced sheriff, Randall Pierce. Lauren stood in the courtroom as the judge read the decision that unwound 3 years of exile. Her conviction, once spoken as if it were the final word of the universe, was vacated. She was declared innocent, not pardoned, as though forgiven for a sin she had never committed, but cleared, her name restored to the person it had belonged to all along. The compensation awarded to her felt distant, abstract. What mattered was the simple fact that the law, so long twisted against her, had at last turned toward the light. News traveled fast across Red Hollow. The same mouths that had whispered against her now whispered something else. Uneasy apologies, private shame, complicated guilt. Some came to her in person, hats clutched in their hands, eyes lowered, asking forgiveness they weren't sure they deserved. Lauren listened. She didn't offer grand speeches. She accepted sincerity and let the rest drift away like dust over the valley. She had carried the weight of their judgment long enough. She wasn't about to carry their penance too. During those long days, Daniel Carter was her constant. Not loud, not showy, just there. He waited outside courtrooms. He rode with her to town. He fixed the squeak in the kitchen door and pretended it needed doing urgently when the strain of memories pressed too hard. Love didn't arrive for them like thunder. It came quietly, like rain returning to dry ground, soaking in before either of them dared name it. Ellie, with the unfiltered wisdom of children, saw it first. She began setting 3 plates as if the rhythm were permanent, not temporary. Sometimes she would slip her hand into Lauren's and declare the world better now, and somehow it was. But Lauren didn't want her life to end at the clearing of her name. She wanted it to mean something. She had seen what ignorance had allowed powerful men to do, how paperwork and legalese had been wielded like weapons against people who couldn't read them. So she asked Daniel a question one evening as they watched the last light fold itself into the hills. What if there were a school? A small one, a place where children could learn, and adults too if they wished. So they would never again sign away land they didn't understand or be silenced by words on a page. Daniel didn't laugh. He didn't tell her it was too much or too big. He simply nodded, as though she had suggested repairing a fence. Then we'll build it, he said. They cleared out the old parlor first, a room still thick with Grace's memory. Daniel worried that turning it into a classroom might feel like erasing his wife. But Lauren didn't want to erase anyone. She kept Grace's rocking chair, polishing the wood until it gleamed softly, and placed it near the front where the light fell best. When the school opened, that chair became a symbol, not of mourning, but of a woman whose questions had helped save them all. The first months were clumsy and beautiful. Children arrived barefoot, shy, clutching slates and bits of chalk. Adults came in the evenings, hats crumpled in nervous hands, embarrassed by the alphabet but hungry to learn. Lauren taught them letters, numbers, the shape of words, and the way signatures carried power. Daniel repaired desks, chopped wood for the stove, and sometimes, on winter nights, read aloud from newspapers so the valley could hear itself reflected in the wider world. Ellie sat at the front like a little flame of attention, scribbling, whispering answers, beaming whenever Lauren praised her neat handwriting. Red Hollow began to change. Slowly, unevenly, but change it did. People no longer met the law with blind trust. They demanded to understand it. Neighbors helped rebuild farms that had barely survived the conspiracy. Even the church pews seemed to hold a different kind of silence, less resigned, more awake. No town erases its sins entirely, but Red Hollow started the hard work of living honestly with its past. Through it all, Lauren and Daniel moved in a steady orbit around one another. Some evenings they spoke about Grace, the love Daniel had lost, the courage she had shown. Lauren never asked him to forget, and he never asked her to be anyone's replacement. Their love grew in the space Grace had left, not over the top of it. And when Daniel finally reached for Lauren's hand one twilight as the wind smoothed the fields, it felt less like a beginning and more like a truth that had been waiting patiently to be acknowledged. Federal trials concluded. Prison sentences were handed down. Ethan Caldwell returned east, offering a quiet handshake and a promise that if ever the valley needed him again, word would find its way. Life did what life always does in the West. It kept going. Cattle needed tending, fences broke, children argued about fractions. Ellie outgrew her dresses faster than Lauren could hem them. But some nights, when the lanterns were low and the house had fallen still, Lauren would sit in Grace's chair and listen to the wind slip through the grass outside. She would think of the girl she had been 3 years earlier, terrified, hunted, certain the world had no place left for her. And she would feel a soft ache of gratitude that defied words. Not gratitude for what had happened to her. That pain would always carry its own scar. But gratitude for survival. For truth. For the strange, fierce path that had led her to a kitchen table covered in chalk dust. And a future not dictated by fear. Justice had not healed everything. Some wounds never close completely. Yet in the Carter house, in the laughter spilling from the little schoolroom, in the steady presence of a man who loved her without conditions, Lauren found something better than perfection. She found a beginning. The wedding came without spectacle, the way rain sometimes arrives on a day the sky never promised. There were wildflowers in jars, tables built from borrowed planks, and a small gathering of neighbors who had learned the hard way that kindness was worth showing up for. Daniel stood at the front of the church in a clean shirt and a jacket that had clearly lived other lives before this one. Lauren walked toward him with Ellie at her side, the child carrying a simple bouquet with both hands as though it were the most important treasure in the world. No choir sang, no grand speeches filled the air. Instead, there was the quiet rustle of dresses, the faint creak of pews, and the hush of a town witnessing something that felt like repair. When the minister spoke, he kept to the words that mattered. Promise, honor, protect, cherish. And Lauren felt each one settle into the bruised places inside her as if they had been written there long ago, waiting for this moment to be spoken aloud. Daniel's voice was steady when he repeated them. His hand was warm around hers. Ellie, solemn with pride, slipped her little fingers into Lauren's free hand and held on tight. Afterward, they ate cake baked by 3 different women who all insisted theirs had been necessary. Ellie ran in circles with other children beneath the cottonwoods. Men clapped Daniel on the back. Women hugged Lauren with that awkward sincerity of people still learning how to say, "I'm sorry," without saying it directly. The day moved like water, slow, reflective, bright in places, shadowed in others. And yet it never tried to be more than it was. 2 people choosing one another in a world that had once chosen against them. Back at the ranch, the house did not feel divided between past and present anymore. Grace's rocking chair remained where it had been, polished to a soft glow, a witness rather than a ghost. Sometimes Lauren would sit in it with Ellie curled against her side, reading aloud from the primers she used in the little school. Daniel would listen from the table, repairing tools or oiling tack, the familiar rhythm of ordinary life creating a harmony no one ever conducted but everyone felt. Nights were gentler now. Laughter had returned to the walls, not loud or careless, but steady, like a fire that knew it belonged in the hearth. The town of Red Hollow did not change overnight, but the change was real. People spoke more carefully. The law was questioned when it needed to be, trusted when it earned that trust. Some families reclaimed land they had thought gone forever. Others found ways to rebuild with the help of those who, months earlier, had stood aside. The school grew. Adults arrived in the evening with calloused hands and shy eyes, learning letters one slow shape at a time. Lauren guided them with patience that had been forged out of suffering and a deep belief that knowledge was a form of armor the world could never fully take away. Daniel helped whenever he could, his voice carrying through the room as he read the newspaper, explaining the larger world to people who had once assumed it was not meant for them. Soon after the wedding, a letter arrived addressed in a hand Lauren recognized and feared. It was from her brother, the last piece of family she had left before the world turned on her. He wrote with halting honesty, apologizing for the distance he had kept, for the silence that had felt like betrayal. He spoke of regret, of the way shame had choked his courage, and he asked forgiveness, if not now, then someday. Lauren read the letter twice, then folded it with care. She did not answer immediately. Healing, she understood, was not a performance. It was a slow untying of knots. But the fact that the letter existed at all felt like a door opening where once there had only been brick. Seasons shifted. Winter pressed against the windows, and then withdrew. Spring scattered color across the valley as if it were trying to make up for lost time. Children grew, their handwriting neater, their questions bolder. Ellie thrived at the center of it all, her laughter ringing out across the yard like a bell. Her trust in the world restored piece by fragile piece. She called Lauren Mama one day without thinking, and the word landed softly in the room, surprising all three of them. Daniel looked up, eyes warm with something deeper than happiness. Lauren gathered Ellie close, tears slipping down her cheeks with no need to hide. Sometimes, late at night, when the lamps were out and the house lay still, Lauren would step onto the porch and look across the valley. She remembered the woman who had first arrived here, hollowed by judgment and hunted by a lie. She could still feel the sting of the diner door closing in her face, the ache of being unwelcome everywhere she went. But now, standing where she belonged, she understood that her story was not simply one of injustice endured. It was also a story of persistence, of quiet resilience, of the way a single act of kindness, one barefoot child returning a dropped bundle, could rewrote an entire life. Red Hollow would always carry its history. So would she. Yet neither was defined by the worst thing that had ever happened to them. Truth had weighed heavy on the town, pressing it toward honesty. Love had crossed the boundaries grief once guarded. And freedom, real freedom, had come not in the form of escape, but in the form of roots finally allowed to take hold. On the last evening before summer reached its full heat, Lauren sat in Grace's chair with the windows open and the night drifting in. Daniel leaned against the door frame. Ellie slept upstairs, safe, unafraid. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with a sound like breathing. Lauren closed her eyes and let the quiet wrap around her. She did not run anymore. She did not hide. She was home. Let the story end gently now. Lauren Hayes came to Red Hollow carrying the weight of injustice, and for a long time she believed the world would never let her lay it down. But kindness found her where the law had failed. Truth rose, slow and difficult, until it could no longer be ignored. Love returned, not as a replacement for the past, but as a companion to it. Daniel Carter, steady and patient, gave her a place to stand. Ellie gave her a reason to stay, and the town, with all its flaws and failings, learned how to look itself in the eye again. Justice did not erase what had happened. It simply allowed life to move forward instead of circling the same wound. In the end, Lauren found freedom not on the road, but in belonging. Belonging to a family, a community, a future built with open hands instead of closed fists. Picture the house in the quiet dark, the lamp burning low, the valley breathing beyond the windows. Let the story soften, slow, almost a whisper. Because sometimes the bravest ending is simply this: everything finally, peacefully, being all right. End of article. Good night.